Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Kaleohu, who asked, "Hey Thor, as one of the Last Jedi enjoyers, I still struggle with the levels of hate it gets. My current theory is that the divisiveness comes from Rian Johnson's attempt to ground the franchise into something more realistic and less fantastical. I personally loved that approach and hoped it could have brought new life into the franchise for younger generations. I think Andor, by comparison, manages to be grounded because it lacked the preconceptions the audience had of legacy characters like Luke. Do you think Disney and JJ made a mistake by leaning so hard into the legacy characters as opposed to focusing on building something new for the sequel trilogy? That approach made a lot of money for Force Awakens, but given the current state of the franchise, does that still matter?" And I actually think it's the opposite. I don't think they leaned heavily enough into the legacy characters in the sequels. Keeping in mind I'm talking about back then, because nowadays people dread them using the legacy characters out of fear they'll butcher them further. But back then, seeing those characters again is what sold those movies. It's the reason there was so much hype going into The Force Awakens.
Chewie, we're home.
We all wanted to see Han, Luke, Leia, Lando, Chewie, and all the rest of them again. Some of us had even been waiting decades since the original trilogy days to see those characters again. And so I think arguably the biggest mistake the sequels made, outside of just not having a plan or one cohesive vision for the whole trilogy, but I think the biggest mistake was not making the sequels more about the legacy characters, especially at the start or with the first film, and then having this slower transition to the newer characters, because I have no issue with them bringing in some new heroes. That absolutely should have been done. These films should have also been about the next generation, and yes, had some new, fresh ideas as well, especially when it comes to the villains of the trilogy, but we'll get to that in a bit. But first, with the trilogy, instead of just immediately pushing all the new characters to the forefront, let everyone get a movie with all the heroes of old rising to the occasion one more time to save the day. And certainly don't make all those old heroes broken and sad. Do not make it where Han, Solo, and Leia did not work out. I mean, whose idea was that? And how did anyone who loves Star Wars, who read the script at Lucasfilm, how did they read that? How did they read Han and Leia separated and sign off on that and say, yeah, let's make this movie? And certainly, above all else, do not withhold Luke Skywalker from the first film of the trilogy. Don't show him at the very end of it on an island somewhere and leave us all hanging. You took all the crazy hype that was already around the return of Luke, and you intensified it by wrapping it up in this big mystery of why is he on this island, why did he leave his family and friends. And then, when The Last Jedi came out, it felt like you let all the air out of that balloon when it comes to Luke, because it turns out he just gave up. We waited all this time to find out that Luke Skywalker just gave up on being a Jedi because he almost murdered his nephew. How awesome is that? And how it pales in comparison to what the EU did with the same character, the EU that Disney, in their infinite wisdom, decided to erase. In other words here, you let people, again, wait decades to see Luke, and then instead of giving him to the fans the way we pretty much all wanted to see him, the way he once was in the books of old that are beloved by some of your most loyal and hardcore fans, you made them wait 2 more years to build up even more hype, not to mention to theorize for 2 years about what he was up to and how he'd relate to Rey and all these other things, and some of these theories were pretty dang good. Only to do none of that, to let the writer and director of the next film mock those who thought there would be more to any of it, and then made Luke a broken old hermit who almost again killed his nephew and then dies using the Force too hard. Again, how awesome. But not only that, but in the movie, in The Last Jedi, instead of trying to, trying to save his nephew Ben Solo in that last encounter between them, Luke basically mocks him and pushes him further to the dark side. Luke treats Kylo little different than Vader treated him in The Empire Strikes Back, actually, by toying with him and trying to frustrate and anger him, all in an effort to turn him. Luke is doing the same thing Vader once did, in a manner of speaking. The guy who once saved Darth Vader with essentially just believing in his father now ridicules his own nephew and makes him look bad in front of his friends, you could say. and gives him this very stupid quip before just dying.
See you around, kid.
Thus again, cementing Kylo Ren being on the dark side by making him beyond angry. Once again, how awesome is all of this? Glad I waited over 3 decades to see the continuation of these characters' stories. And who at Lucasfilm read this script and signed off on this one? Who thought that it was something Luke Skywalker would actually do? And quite honestly, that encounter between those characters, how Luke treats his nephew, might just be the worst thing in the entire sequel trilogy. And look here, I am not mad at you for liking the movie or asking the question. People can absolutely like what was done with Luke or like The Last Jedi if they want to. As I always say, no hate is intended towards anyone who enjoyed the movie and or Luke in it, and I appreciate your question here. Do not take anything I say as an attack on you personally. But doing what was done to the heroes of old was such a huge mistake in my opinion. It is the main reason why the franchise is essentially in shambles. And it is so ironic that the villain of The Last Jedi, that Kylo Ren, talks about killing the past, and then that's exactly what the movie itself does. It kills the legacy of one of the greatest characters in the history of film, one of the characters who made Star Wars what it is in the first place, and now they don't even have that to fall back on anymore. Like I said before, now people dread the thought of using these old characters, of seeing Luke Skywalker again. Can you imagine going back in time 10 years before The Force Awakens came out and saying after this trilogy, people are going to hope and pray they never use any of these characters ever again? Moving on though, and very quickly, I know I've talked about this before, but the other big problem with The Last Jedi, for me anyway, is that it's just not a very good movie in and of itself. I recently rewatched it and did a video, and my conclusion was, it's just not a good movie. It's not one that really makes a lot of sense, that if you take all the Star Wars out of it and just judge it on its own, not worrying about how it handles Luke Skywalker or how it handles the Star Wars lore or anything like that, it would just be seen as a pretty nonsensical, maybe average sci-fi film, which is what I would say separates it from Andor. That Andor on its own is something phenomenal and is elevated by being Star Wars, and I would say actually The Last Jedi brings down Star Wars, but let's not get too deep into that. And when you really think about it, the plot of The Last Jedi is what exactly? A few ships trying to very slowly get away from a lot of other ships so that a resistance doesn't die out? And instead of the bad guys doing whatever it takes to end this resistance with their far superior forces and numbers to stop this last holdout of good guys from preventing them from just taking over the galaxy totally, they just kind of slowly follow them for hours upon hours. And I guess they're hoping that the resistance doesn't come up with some sort of plan to escape in the meantime. A plan like, oh, I don't know, evacuating one of their ships, the Radis, I suppose, sending everyone from that ship onto the 2 other ships, and then using the Radis to ram into the Supremacy. I mean, if that works, and it most certainly did, and everyone in that film, from Hux to Poe to Holdo herself, obviously, they seem to think it was going to work from their reactions. Despite the next film telling us it was a 1 in a million, because at least that film realized the damage something like that working would do to all the lore.
We need to put some holdo maneuvers, do some real damage.
Come on, that move is 1 in a million.
That it called into question the strategy of every other space battle in the history of the Star Wars galaxy, or since the invention of the hyperdrive anyway. But if the holdo maneuver works, why not open with it in this situation? If you are being tracked by the lead ship, if you cannot escape via hyperspace because of that lead ship, because of the Supremacy, again, you just evacuate the Radis, you use a droid to pilot the ship and hyperdrive the thing into the Supremacy, thus doing major damage to the flagship of the enemy, not to mention many of their other ships. And then in your other 2 ships, you jump to hyperspace and you live to fight another day. And sure, you sacrifice your flagship, but at least you have survived. It is a much, much better plan than heading straight for what I'm assuming is the only inhabitable planet anywhere within light years and expecting the First Order to not think you may try to some way, somehow hide out there on, again, this habitable planet you've been flying towards for 18 hours. And doing that instead of just riding it out in the ships and dying eventually. Not to mention this plan of using crate sacrifices all of your ships, and my plan only costs you one ship, and you don't have to count on the First Order being incredibly stupid and not thinking you might try to hide out on crate, as you just so happen to fly right towards it and right past it. And again, I mean no offense here. I mean no disrespect. You can love this movie. That is absolutely fine with me. There are movies I love that other people would say are bad. And we can argue all day if we really want to. But in the end, we enjoy what we enjoy, and that is perfectly fine. There's no reason getting angry and hating people because we don't like the same movies. But those are, for me at least, I can't speak for every other fan out there who doesn't like the sequels or doesn't like The Last Jedi in particular, I should say. But for me, those are pretty much the main two reasons I do not like that film. It fumbles the legacy of Luke Skywalker, and it turned him into a child, basically, with how he handles or acts towards his nephew. That the last encounter he'll ever have with him before he dies, he uses it to seemingly push him further towards the dark side. And that space chase is just utterly ridiculous when you try to apply any logic to it whatsoever, and I mean that both ways, both the First Order and the Resistance. Both sides just completely miss much, much better strategies, and they just fly along for the sake of giving us that amazing Canto Bight subplot, I guess. I really don't know what they were thinking with that whole chase sequence and making it, again, the center or plot of the entire movie. Well, that is going to be all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn. Take to the comments below and tell me why you don't like The Last Jedi or why you do like The Last Jedi. Or feel free to ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you got to do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor," you ask your question, and I will try to answer it in a future video. But whatever the case may be, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.